So I'm delighted to welcome Theresa Laverty today, and she's going to be talking to us about her PhD work in Namibia, and I'm really excited to hear more about this. I've done some work in Namibia and it's an incredible country. So over to Theresa to introduce herself.
Hi there, my name is Theresa Laverty. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Colorado State University. But as Rachel said, I did my PhD work in Namibia, and that's what I'm excited to talk to you guys about today. Let me just get the screen sharing going. Okay, is that all set up?
Yes, that's all good to go. Yeah.
Awesome. So the research that I'll be talking about today was fieldwork that I conducted between 2015 and 2017 in the northern Namib Desert. But before I get into that, I'm going to give a little bit of background as to why I was interested in the questions I was asking. So for many of us, we're interested in why biodiversity exists where it is. Why do we find many species in the tropics, fewer species further from the tropics, and how does that relate to the ecosystems and the other species and plants present in these systems? And we can think about scale at multiple levels, whether it's a whole Arctic scale, where we're talking about species that span different continents here. This is the brown bear. Or if we're talking about at smaller scales, whether this is across, say, a mountaintop where you have different species present at different elevations, as you do with the chipmunks here, or even at a smaller scale where you have microhabitat differences that can cause differential use of different species within a single tree, as was conducted in the Pine Barrens down by my hometown area in New Jersey. But of course, we know that multiple factors affect species distributions. This includes abiotic factors. This is very well studied for, cold water freshwater fish. This is a West Slope cutthroat trout. They are known to exist only in cold water systems. Once it gets above a certain temperature, basically these fish will die. So this is really well studied in the areas where I live today, out here in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. But of course, biotic interactions matter as well. And so we know that different species interact and can affect how species are distributed on the landscape. So the most famous study that I think of when I think of this is the marine barnacles out in Washington, where you have Thamellus and Balanus that coexist in these distributions. However, in isolation, it's known that Thamellus can extend the entire portion of the intertidal zone. So basically, Balanus is said to competitively exclude Thamellus from those lower reaches. And nowhere are these factors as extreme when we talk about abiotic drivers in desert systems, where we're extremely limited from a rainfall perspective, oftentimes at one of the temperature extremes. It could be either a very cold desert or a very hot desert. And competition for resources in these areas may be very intense. Nowhere is competition for resources maybe as intense as in deserts. So the question that I was trying to get at here was, what are the roles of abiotic and biotic factors in structuring desert communities? And by desert communities, I was particularly interested in bats. Deserts and rangelands make up about 1/3 of the Earth's terrestrial surface area. They're generally characterized by lower biodiversity levels, but it's in these systems that we can find a lot of endemic species as well. Deserts are not always characterized by hot temperatures, but can have cold temperatures, but they all share in common a very high variation. What you're seeing here is the coefficient of variation of interannual precipitation. So from year to year, rainfall levels can really vary, oftentimes above 42%. The desert that I worked in was the Namib Desert along the western coast of Namibia. It spans from southern Angola into northern South Africa. I particularly was working in the northwest reaches of the desert. And I forgot to put this back to kilometers. It's about 9,500 square miles. It's a really large area. I'm trying to remember. It was like 26, but I'm going to be wrong. So a really large area. I was particularly working, if you're from Namibia and are familiar with the area, between the Horisib and the just above the Uchab River. So when most people think of the Namib Desert, they think of a scene like this. Some of the world's largest sand dunes, and Deadvlei is very well known for having these standing dead trees that were alive probably about 1,000 years ago. However, the northern reaches of the Namib Desert look a little different. Something like this, where you have these kind of really rocky canyons interspersed with trees, generally kind of low vegetation density outside of those rocky canyons. But what makes the Namib Desert so interesting is that it has a very intact, large herbivore community. This includes 3 species of megaherbivores, the largest free-ranging population of black rhino. You have African elephants, Angolan giraffe, as well as many other species and people in this area who live with their cattle, sheep, and goats. This is generally a pastoralist community. So my research was concentrated in river systems where we experienced the greatest changes in vegetation abundance and species richness. Basically, these rivers are oases or hot spots for life, and they're disproportional in structuring desert communities. Most of these river systems are dry. They're highly ephemeral. And so we're lucky if about 20 days a year, you may have a river flow, and that would be an extremely wet season. These are not usually driven by local rains, but rains very far away. When the rivers do flow, this brings a huge, a bit of diversity to the desert. You'll have birds that migrate in, insects bloom, and it kind of releases a lot of the more resident wildlife from concentrating around water holes. So of course, I was interested in my research at looking at seasonal differences in the Namib Desert. And I was fortunate to be out there during a particularly wet season. So what I'm going to be talking about today, I had about a 1.5 year field season, and that's what I'm going to be concentrating on. The more permanent water sources in this area include natural springs and artificial pools or boreholes. These are constructed both for wildlife and livestock in the desert. And they're basically there to supplement wildlife populations. The ones constructed for wildlife is to get them away from human settlements to reduce conflicts with species like elephants. But no matter the type of water hole, we really know that in desert systems, water does act as these real strong biodiversity hotspots. And this is true not just for diurnal species, where you can see a higher abundance of species and individuals around these water holes, but also for nocturnal species like bats. One of the first things that many bats in these ecosystems tend to do when they wake up in the evening is to go search for a water hole and take a drink. So that's kind of where all of my sampling efforts were targeted around. And of course, if you're interested in community ecology, as I am and many of you are, bats are a great system to study. We know that there's an incredible amount of biodiversity, and that even in some of these areas that are thought to typically have less biodiversity, like deserts, there can be quite an array of species. So this kind of sets me up. I was interested in how bats may be interacting with other species around water holes and people and their livestock in these areas as well. So I'm going to jump right into some of my first work that was asking, what roles do abiotic factors play in structuring desert communities? And before I get too far, when I say I mean we, and when I say we, I mean all these folks here. I had a great team to work with of collaborators and folks in the field with me. And that includes quite a bit of people that aren't listed here. I just want to give recognition that there was a lot of help from many different resources on the ground. So in terms of abiotic factors, you can guess that I'm quite interested in water. And in this area, what I mean here, not all water is the same. And water in particular can really vary in quality. So this natural spring that you're seeing out here in the Huab River is a highly saline body of water, but even at these systems, you'll find species like elephants come and drink, and several bat species. And so I was kind of interested in how water quality may be affecting bat distributions and not just water quantity. So my general prediction here was, if water quality is driving bat distributions, we would expect higher bat activity and species richness at higher water quality sites. During my year and a half, I kind of split into two different sampling periods for this question. So I was looking at the end of the dry season and at the end of the wet season to see how does water quality differ and how does that affect bat distributions. So I would collect, for every night of bat sampling, I would also be collecting a sample of water. And this included just a general, like, standard water kit that was done at a lab, things like pH, conductivity, concentrations of things like calcium, sodium, chloride, potassium, as well as in the wet season, I also looked at heavy metal concentrations. And generally, poor water quality is indicated by higher concentrations of all these ions. So you usually need a little bit for like your health, but too much can be very bad. I was sampling over 5 different artificial pools and 18 natural springs in this area. As I mentioned, from the Sesfontaine Conservancy just down into the Doranawas Conservancy. And my first question was really, are there water quality differences across the different seasons or across these different types of water bodies? And to be short, there weren't. So what I'm displaying here is a PCA. All you really need to know is that points that are close together on this plot associate more with one another. And so they're more similar than points that are distant. So I kind of separated this into the different river catchments we were looking at. And what I generally saw is that there were, while there weren't differences between season or water body type, there were kind of underlying spatial differences. And so this may be due to groundwater differences or geology differences between the different river systems that I worked on. But in general, there are water quality differences across these sites. So to follow that up, I was using acoustic sampling to monitor the bat community. And we'd have the bat detectors up a half hour before sunset until a half hour after sunrise. As many of you are probably aware, acoustic surveys are a really great non-invasive tool for bat sampling. Many different species have different call shapes and sizes. These are just 3 of the species that are found in my study area, and the frequencies here vary from closer to 20 kilohertz to about 130 kilohertz for Sandoval's leaf-nosed bat. And to give you a better idea, this is some of the different calls that I actually got from the system. So some species are really easy to distinguish, like the Hippocyterus and the Rhinolophus species. Others get a little bit more nuanced, but you are able to more or less determine which species are present in this area. And I was able to kind of build not per se a call library just yet, but I was able to kind of build an understanding with these species, because during that 1.5 years, I was also capturing bats in mist nets, and was able to kind of distinguish which species were present in the system. So I was pairing acoustic sampling with mist netting from different times of the year to understand which bats are in that area. Another benefit of acoustic sampling is that we work in a really cool area, but working around these water holes at night isn't always the safest thing to do. And I think my field assistants told me that a lot. But it's a really cool place to be. And while many species will avoid drinking water while we're present at a water hole, these species will not. Rhinos and elephants will come up. Rhinos will be afraid if they do actually detect you. And then we've had lions visit some of our sites while we were mist netting as well. So a really cool system to work in. You just have to be really attentive. But to give you an idea of some of the diversity of the species that we captured in this area, you had, trying to think, I think there were about 7 or 8 different families of bats. We had 1 or 2 endemic species, and through mist netting alone, we were also able to detect some of these fruit bats in the area. Even eidolon seemed to be blown off course during the winter west winds that we get. But the epilated fruit bat here that you're seeing, the Angolan epilated fruit bat, is an endemic to this area. And these kind of rely on the fruiting fig and date trees right next to these bodies of water that I was sampling. So getting back to the study, for this research, I was basically out there recording for about a total of 46 nights. On those nights, I recorded 120,000 bat passes of 16 different species. 23 of those nights was in the dry season and 23 nights in the wet season, sampling the exact same site. Species richness did not really differ across seasons or across those 2 water body types, artificial pools or boreholes and natural springs. But activity really kind of did. And so what we found is that activity was always nearly twice as high at the boreholes as they were at the natural springs. And during the wet season, we had about twice as much activity compared to the dry season. But I should note that while we had more activity at these artificial pools or boreholes, 6 of the 16 species that we recorded were only present at natural springs. And so this indicates that there may be some underlying function there that may be driving bat distributions in ways that we're not aware of. It could be the amount of vegetation or habitat around these water bodies, but this kind of requires quite a bit more investigation of seeing whether artificial pools could actually function in the role of natural springs in these landscapes. So then I was interested in how water quality versus availability affects bat distributions. I'm going to walk through this really fast, but basically I was using generalized linear models to do this. And back from that PCA plot, I had 2 axes that were very associated with water quality, and 1 axis, PC3, that was associated with water size or availability, basically the surface area of a spring. I was looking both at community level responses, so the overall bat activity and the overall species richness at a site, as well as species specific bat activity. And I only looked at this for 6 species that had greater than 1,000 total passes, and that were recorded on at least 50% of the nights of sampling. And then I did AIC model selection to kind of pick out these top models. For the community level responses, I found that water salinity was negatively related with overall activity. So basically, the more salty a site was, the less bat activity we had at a site. And this was kind of in agreement with our predictions. Higher water salinity is poor water quality. We'd expect more activity. On the other hand, it was also higher. We found that overall activity, as you saw in that plot, was also higher at artificial pools, regardless of seasons. And initially, I had predicted that natural springs would harbor more bats. Not only were there more of these sites, but they tend to have a higher diversity of shapes and sizes and vegetation communities around them. So this was not in agreement with my initial predictions. The 6 species that we were able to study on are highlighted here. Basically, these were the ones that had greater than 1,000 calls and were present on more than half of the nights. For the species level responses, I can go through this in more detail at a later time, but basically, I think it may depend a little bit more on wing morphology and feeding or foraging guild. So basically, we found that the molluscid species, the really fast flying species in this area, were positively related to surface area, and both for 1 species during the dry season and 1 during the wet season. We did find a couple of relationships for some of these other species, but only 1 of them was actually related to water quality in the direction I predicted. Neuromycia zuluensis was activity was lower at sites with higher iron concentrations. And so, yeah, basically what I found is no species of the 6 that I was able to examine more in depth here were really ideal bioindicators of water quality in this region. However, we did find that in general at these saltier sites, we have less bat activity. So those community level responses may be a better predictor of water quality in this region. So to wrap up this work, water quality differences did exist across sites, and the effect of water quality on particular bat species really varied. And it was really those community level responses that were maybe a better indicator of water quality in the system. There we go. But I just want to remind you, these artificial pools or borehole relationships with bat conservation are kind of unknown. So we have higher bat activity at these sites, about twice as much activity at artificial pools compared to natural springs, regardless of season. However, a couple of those species that we found in this region were never present over these artificial pools. So a lot more investigation is needed in this area. And it would be really cool if you were able to actually go in there before a borehole was constructed and have an idea of how the bat community changes after the addition of these features. It may just simply be that roosting habitat is what's really driving bat distributions in this area. But we were basically unable. We had 1 truck and usually 2 people at a time, me and 1 other person. So unable to kind of do radio telemetry and figure out where all these species were living. I'll have to go back with Rachel sometime and try that out. So moving on, I then was interested in how biotic factors may contribute to structuring desert-back communities. And basically, wildlife in deserts is oftentimes concentrated around these bodies of water, and you get what's called a biosphere effect. Basically, in areas very close to water, herbivores can have very large effects on the ecosystem. In areas further from water, in desert systems in particular, herbivores are thought to really not impact the plant communities in substantial ways, and plants are thought to be more rainfall limited. But of course, when we think of food webs, we typically think of carnivores at the top of these food webs, but the role of large herbivores in these landscapes can be quite significant. And some of our most famous food web ecologists, Payne here, he's recognized after his work on Piaster, the sea star, basically he has shown that rampant indirect effects can be expected of mammalian herbivores in food webs. And that this would be expected to be quite great in areas where we have megaherbivores. But of course, this is of importance, these relationships, because many of the world's largest herbivores are in decline globally. And so basically what I was interested in doing is trying to see how these herbivores in a very untouched desert ecosystem relatively to other systems may actually function to interact and structure different communities in this landscape. So the levels of the food web that I was working with here were herbivores clustered around bodies of water, feeding on vegetation. And of course, vegetation communities can really impact insect communities. And most of the bats in the system that I was studying were insectivores. And so I was kind of interested in this general food web here. I did not really know the strength of these factors, and there can be many different arrows drawn here, which is why I have the question marks up there. So basically, I was interested in like an additional measurable factor that would structure this environment. So the three levels that I was looking at in particular were megaherbivores, their effects on vegetation, and how this may be affecting insectivore populations. I was looking a little bit at insect communities, but it's quite hard in desert landscapes to try to misnet and do acoustic samples and have like light traps up, because this could be affecting bat behavior. And so much of what I'm doing here is just looking at these three levels highlighted in green. So mega herbivores in this system are particularly unique because not only are they consuming a lot of vegetation, but they can change the 3D structure of the landscape. Elephants in particular are bringing down branches and debarking trees and can really open up habitat or kind of close up habitat depending on their behavior. And then you have the Angolan giraffe and the black rhino in the system, which generally use sub-river channels and aren't overlapping as much with elephants. Elephants tend to be a little more concentrated in the main river channels, but they're all impacting vegetation in the system. And on a per individual basis, we would expect these mega herbivores to have much greater impacts than smaller herbivores, even giraffe or springbok in this area. Or sorry, even zebra or springbok in this area. So to look at the mega herbivore communities, I was using Dung Transects, where basically I had staked out a couple of different transect lines and would revisit each month, identify, count, and remove all dung piles to get a general estimate of mega herbivore use. Then in terms of the vegetation community, I was relying a lot on NDVI. So basically, I was using Sentinel-2 satellite data to get an idea of basically how green is a system, like how much new vegetative growth is occurring in these areas within a 1 kilometer buffer around each of these water holes. So what you're seeing here, darker green indicates higher productivity. The coast of Namibia is very dry, and as you get further and further inland, we have a lot more rain and a lot more vegetation in general. The deserts right along the border there, or the coast there. So this is the dry season versus the wet season. If you look at like Palmvog area, you'll see that the green really starts to creep in during the wet season. And some of those river channels get a lot darker as well, particularly if the water is flowing. So I paired the Dung Transect data with these measurements, these satellite measurements of vegetation productivity with the bat acoustic data set that I talked about before, and was using structural equation modeling. Basically, it's a form of path analysis that allows you to look at how these different variables can react simultaneously rather than using different univariate relationships to look at how megaherbivores relate with vegetation productivity and bat activity and species richness in these sites. And this can either happen direct, where megaherbivores are directly affecting the bat community, indirectly, where megaherbivores are only affecting bats through their effects on vegetation, or both, a combination of these direct and indirect relationships between megaherbivores and bats. So basically, for each season, I was running these models differently because I thought there would be some seasonal differences here, and found that during the dry season, our most supported model, running these against each other, doing AIC model selection, was this direct and indirect effects model. So basically, during the dry season, direct and indirect effects model was the top model. What you're seeing here is a partial regression coefficients with R² values representing the amount of variation explained for each variable up until that point in the model. The gray lines are representing statistically insignificant partial regression coefficients. So for bat species richness, what we're seeing is that the most supported pathway was an indirect relationship with megaherbivores, where megaherbivores and vegetation productivity had a positive relationship. This could either be due to megaherbivores trimming vegetation in a way that stimulated growth, or it could be due to them actually clustering in areas where there's greener vegetation. And then for vegetation productivity had a positive relationship with bat species richness, which is what we would predict in the system. In other studies, they've shown that insect abundance tends to increase with vegetation productivity, and with NDVI in particular. So this relationship is probably reflecting that bats are more diverse in areas with higher food availability. So it also could be reflecting differences that megaherbivores create in the 3D structure of plant communities in these systems, allowing less maneuverable bat species, basically those mollusids in this case, the fast flying ones that may not be around such dense vegetation clusters, better access into these sites. On the left-hand side, you're seeing that bat activity, or the total number of calls recorded in a night, was directly related to megaherbivore use, which suggests to me that megaherbivores themselves may be supporting higher insect densities, like biting flies in the system. But they may, but also the presence of their dung may be beneficial for insect populations. This area is extremely dry, and so those elephant dung balls or boluses are quite important to a lot of insects in this area. So this could be promoting potentially more bat activity as well. For the wet season, I did not find any model that supported significant relationships between megaherbivores and bats. Basically, this wasn't totally surprising to me. I did think there'd be seasonal differences, but when you have these running river systems in areas that are typically dry, it's releasing animals from their need to concentrate around these permanent bodies of water. And bats may be tracking highly ephemeral insect resources in this area, as was pictured here. This is a Roberts flat-headed bat, Saramus petrophilus, that was feeding over a flowing river on the night beforehand, and basically had dried mud caked over his nose that I kindly peeled off before releasing him. But megaherbivores in this system may be searching out different areas where there's greener or newer vegetation growth. So this may cause a disconnect in the spatial distribution between bats and megaherbivores during the wet season. So to wrap up this part of the work, I found that the conservation of megaherbivores, particularly in the dry season or drought years in this landscape, may promote bat conservation and biodiversity. Basically, they were directly and indirectly positively related with bat activity and with bat species richness. And given that we know very little about bats in this landscape, but already act to conserve megaherbivores, this is generally a good finding. So in more mesic environments in savanna ecosystem, it's found the densities of megaherbivores may be high enough that they negatively affect insectivorous bird communities, but perhaps in this desert ecosystem where densities are much lower, they're actually able to benefit some of these less studied insectivorous bat communities. But of course, the conservation of megaherbivores does not come without conflict to the people living in these areas. I did quite a bit of social research looking at human value systems and attitudes towards many wildlife species that they live with in this area. You have 4 different ethnic groups living in this area, but all of them use pastoralism as their primary way of life, even if they may have some ecotourism or government job opportunities on the side. And this is what a typical settlement would look like in the Namib Desert. So I conducted 86 interviews, semi-structured interviews in this area with individuals and focus groups to get a higher representation of females and of a particular ethnic group in this area. Some of the work done on wildlife value orientations is published in a conservation science and practice paper. And generally what I found is that people tend to value human and livestock lives over wildlife generally. But at the same time, given their relationships with livestock, many people also had these mutualism or like caring values as well towards wildlife in this ecosystem. So it was really interesting to study. I am working on a small publication on kind of the bat findings that I did, and I'm just going to highlight a couple of them right now. I asked folks, where do bats live in this ecosystem? And a lot of folks have seen them. Over 60% of the interviews had reported seeing bats in houses, whether in their own house or older houses in the neighboring environments. And this is quite common in these systems where you'll have, say, an old campsite where bats will be found on the roof, or especially these thatch roof buildings, many bats may be found there roosting during the day. But in general, people knew, for the most part, where bats were roosting quite accurately, in trees and in caves and in rock crevices. Only a few were unsure in terms of what they were eating. Most people correctly identified insects as the primary food, and a few recognized fruit as well. and scorpions. There were a couple of more guesses in this answer, I would say. They're most likely not eating mealy-pop, for instance, the maize meal that people use to make like a porridge in this area. And then in terms of the bat sighting frequency, I think given the construction of these houses and people's ways of life, being out with their livestock throughout much of the day, they oftentimes see bats every night or almost weekly in the system. Bats are active throughout the entire part of the year. You do definitely have peaks in bat activity during certain parts of the year, and that oftentimes corresponds more with rain, I think, than temperature per se. But it's a community where people are interacting quite a bit with bats. And one thing that I was really happy to take away from this is that most people had very positive attitudes towards bats. So they would describe bats as good animals. This quote here, "In the old days when there was too much rain and the grass was about knee-high, we used to make small huts to live in. The bats came in the huts and they used to help with the mosquitoes as well. We felt happy the bats slept there as well." So many people recognize the benefits of living with bats in terms of an insect pest control in this region, but they also had many different value systems here and wanted to protect most species so that, or conserve most species in these conservancies they live in, so that their future generations, their children, their grandchildren, would all be familiar with the same species that they are. So generally, people are interacting with bats perhaps quite often, but their attitudes towards them were quite positive in this community. I also was interested in any cultural stories that they had about bats. Only about 1/3 of the interviews provided these stories. And for those stories, of those, the 1/3 of interviews, most of them represented bats as bad luck or omens of injury, death, and disease or drought in the system. And only a couple actually thought that bats would bring good rain or good luck. And what was really interesting, if you were on a talk that Tiga gave, I mentioned this, I found that many folks in this area are told when they're children that bat wings can slice their ears off and maybe cause them to rot. Some people question the truth in this just based on their interactions with bats. But there were quite a bit that actually, over half of the people who reported this story actually believed it was true still. So this may kind of keep people away from bats. The one thing that I worry about here is if stories reach this area of bats' connection with diseases that are known to affect the tourism and the money coming into these areas, I would be afraid that negative attitudes may be generated more in the area. But in general, I found that people interact quite nicely with bats in this area. And they were always really curious if I was netting near a spring in a village and would come and spend the night with me. So understanding these human value systems and their attitudes and their cultural stories and beliefs could enhance bat conservation success in these areas. We know what types of information we may want to use in educational campaigns to combat misinformation in these areas. And generally, more interaction with bats in this area may actually benefit people and reduce their fear response towards these species. So I think I only have 2 more slides. I just wanted to highlight, I was part of a collaborative team looking at quite a bit of bat ectoparasites as well in this region. And they still have a couple of small papers coming out on that. If you're interested in this, please feel free to reach out to me or visit my website where I highlight a bunch of these papers. We had I think we had maybe 1 new tick species. We had a couple of mites, some bat flies. Basically in my sampling, I was able to pair with some entomologists here and in Russia and in South Africa to help with identification of these ectoparasites. And so, yeah, basically that's all I really have for you today. The bat community in the Namib Desert is very generally understudied. There's been a couple of museum collection trips into the area dating back to around like the 1930s, but no long-term monitoring has taken place in these areas. So I was really fortunate to get to know the wildlife and the people living in these systems and work with a really great set of collaborators in the area as well. So with that, I just want to thank my funders. There's probably plenty of other people that I missed on here, but I'm really appreciative to everyone's help, including Rachel's actually getting started in Namibia. And if you want to reach me, my email's there. It's just first name, last name @gmail.com. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much for a fantastic talk. And so we've actually got a couple of really nice comments, including one from Hanani saying such a beautiful landscape. So I think we are incredibly lucky to be able to work in such an amazing country. And as Theresa said, she's quite keen to go back. So, do get in touch. Sounds like there could be an awesome opportunity, but I'm definitely there. Kate has said, awesome work. Thanks for sharing. Were any of your sampling sites close to the coastline, and was there a difference in activity and diversity between inland and coastal sites?
So right along the coast, there's actually a national park, Skeleton Coast National Park in that area. And I had one sampling site within there. It was actually a spring with like no vegetation around, and it looks quite saline. But there's generally not a lot of permanent water bodies deep towards the coast. There are a couple like at the mouth of the Namib River, but they're really hard to access and the elephants tend to like them. So it'd be pretty dangerous to be working there at night. And like there's one that's actually quite massive. You could go swimming in it, but it would be really hard to sample bats over. So I did not this time. I think it'd be really interesting, especially now that I've done some of the mist netting work in the area, to go back and do acoustic sampling in that area. But we were about, trying to think, we were less than 30 kilometers from the coast for a lot of our sites, so close, but not right on the shoreline. Was that everything for that question, Rachel?
Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. And we've got another one from Bahirathan saying, nice talk, Theresa. How was endemicity and water sources related? Since you pointed out that 6 of the species were found only in natural pools, I was curious if endemic species had any specific preferences between natural versus artificial pools.
Gotcha. So one of the more endemic species to the Namib, the long-eared bat, the Namibian long-eared bat in that area, I only sampled, I'm trying to think, I don't think I actually ever detected it acoustically in those 2 months of sampling, the 46 nights, but I did capture it occasionally, and I captured it only at natural springs. Another one that is endemic to the Namib, the Angolan winged bat, that species is actually distributed across much of the landscape in that area. And it was interesting. It was one of the species that we had enough activity of to relate to a couple of those different factors. And I think it actually its activity positively related to salinity in that area. So it was one of the ones that did not agree with our initial predictions. But yeah, we found that both at boreholes and natural springs. Most of the other species in there may be found across other areas of South Africa or Central Africa. So I didn't have a ton of endemic species other than those ones, and the fruit bat, which we did not have acoustic recordings for. The Angolan epilated fruit bat is kind of we found it at 1 or 2 natural springs underneath these fruiting fig trees. But yeah, unfortunately, there wasn't enough information to really disentangle those effects.
Excellent, thank you very much.
To follow up on that, I think it was more of the rhinolophus species were only actually found at some of these natural springs. No, the Hippocyterus was at both. So yeah, it wasn't really like a common characteristic across different families or different, like whether they were endemic or not. So.
Excellent, thank you. And so Hanani has said, nice talk. Did you find any relationship between the water availability on the tolerance of the bats to the poor quality of the water for drinking? In other words, when the bats had less water available to drink, would they be willing to drink the water that was of poorer quality?
That's a really good question. And surprisingly, I did not find that. And I think it may be proximity of roost to water holes, but like I said, I don't have any information on roosts in this area. Rachel actually did a little bit of work, I think, in this area, and may know where a couple of roosts are for some of the species. But I did hear bats occasionally in rock crevices, but yeah, very tough to find where they're roosting in this area. A lot of rock crevice roosting bats. Interestingly enough, some of those big bodies of water were very, very saline, like that one I showed at the beginning when I was introducing water quality. And we had, it was primarily molossid activity there, but consistent like throughout the year. And that was always one of our sites where we captured the most bats when we were misnetting. So yeah, they did not tend to switch sites when more clean water was available in the landscape. And I think it may just be because within those river systems, they may flow for a couple of days and then they usually dry out. And the water that flows is oftentimes very high in sediments and everything. So it may not necessarily be the water that they want to drink. And so I think they rely a lot on those permanent bodies of water for more consistent water sources for drinking water.
Excellent, thank you very much. And yeah, so I mean, a lot of the work I've done has really been around sinkholes and caves systems, which are incredibly important. But funnily enough, a lot of people in the area are actually very scared of cave systems. So the bats there are actually protected. But yeah, like you, we had a small student project looking at attitudes to bats, and it was looking at also the attitudes to bats and other wildlife, and it was quite incredible that there wasn't such a negative stereotype to bats, which is actually quite nice, really.
Yeah, they definitely seem to be a little more afraid of things that kill their livestock in that area. So,
and then we have a question from Rich, who says, you found that artificial boreholes seem to be more reliable for bat activity. Could that be because they are less ephemeral? Would the natural water bodies dry up more than the artificial holes? And therefore, could the bats be conditioned to rely more heavily on the boreholes simply because they know that there will always be water there?
That's a good question. For the natural springs that I investigated, these were all basically permanent on the system. There were some days where I don't know if it was the winds combined with the lunar cycle where you'd see a drop in the amount of water there, but there was always water present. They weren't always very deep, but especially the like Vespertilionids, the Sestugo, Seabread, they don't need much water to actually drink from them. So it did not seem to be that way. What it could be, I kind of indicated that there's different vegetation communities. And so some of the boreholes were kind of in really thick vegetation, but most are constructed out of the river channel. Like they're all constructed out of the river channel because they don't want them to flood and be damaged. And for some of those, they're in very open environments. So I think in general, it was just easier for bats to navigate to them and drink from them. And they're like within 50 meters maximum from the river channel itself. So there's great places for them to be feeding on insects still, if they want to be feeding in the river channel. Some of those boreholes weren't always very reliable for water sources because baboons or elephants would maybe damage the pumps that would come into them. And so that's where I was really interested. I had, I think, 2 boreholes in the system, one that I couldn't include in my sampling because it was dry for like 5 months. But basically, how would bat activity change in sites that are really reliable for water and sites that are less reliable? And it actually seemed that some of those boreholes were less reliable. But what also may be the case is those boreholes are pumping up water from groundwater. And it could just be that there's something different about the water. The elephants in particular are really attracted to like kind of salty water, I think, to make up for not having a lot of mineral licks in that area. So it could just be that bats are seeking out specific minerals, and that's what got me interested in this water quality question, but I wasn't really finding that to be the case. What would be interesting is a follow-up study looking at across years when you have more data looking at reproductive condition with water quality. I know Rick Adams here in Colorado has found that pregnant and lactating bats in particular were really seeking out calcium. However, calcium was much more available in the Namib system than it is out here in Colorado. So those are the kind of relationships that I was interested in looking at.
That's fantastic. So you got a thumbs up from Rich, and I mean, it's incredible. I mean, to be honest, the depth and actually that you've managed to cover also in this talk, you could have done 2 PhDs, I'm sure. So we have a final question from Cecilia. She said, "Thanks for a fantastic talk, Theresa. Very interesting and informative." So she has a 3-part question, if that's okay.
Okay.
What were some of the challenges that you faced during your field work? And did you work with a team out there? And if you did it again, is there something that you would aim to do differently?
Those are good questions. I definitely worked with a team. And so I would not recommend working in the system by yourself. As I pointed to earlier, especially for mist netting, it could be quite dangerous to work by yourself in the system and not have somebody who's kind of aware of the general surroundings. There were a couple of nights when I had to run from the mist net to the truck and back up quickly because elephants were coming into water. And at some of these sites, it's been long enough that they haven't drank and they would run to water whether or not I was there or not. And so a couple of nerve-wracking nights for sure. And so I was working initially with a Namibian master's student who's since graduated, Lina Mushabati, who was a student of Seth Asebe at the University of Namibia. She and I overlapped for, I want to say it was February through November for her sampling of the area. And we've got a paper in review where she was looking at kind of the effects of elevation and temperature on bat communities using acoustic surveys. And then after that, I was working with a field tech from the US who happened to be a friend of mine who wanted to come and visit. And I was like, hey, why don't you just stay a little longer and help me out so I can stay through another wet season. And so those were the 2 primary people I worked with, people who got me started in that area. Archie Gavusa was really instrumental in kind of taking me out, showing me how to drive to these areas and highlighting these water holes. He's from Sasantine Conservancy and has worked on a variety of different projects, including ecotourism in that area. But a lot of locals are very afraid to be at water holes at night. They recognize that a lot of animals are drinking there. The biggest challenges for me as an American coming out there I was very much on my own for this project. My advisor had done research in Namibia, but back around 2000 on black rhinos. And so I didn't really have a good system going in and like existing infrastructure. So I camped out of a truck. I brought a backpacking tent and just would camp next to the truck every night. Getting a truck was probably the hardest thing. And I took probably 4 or 5 weeks getting into the country. I bought a truck for the field season and then sold it actually to another PhD student as I was leaving. And just kind of figuring out the day-to-day. So driving up to a site that you had planned to go to and then finding rhinos nearby and knowing that they would probably be at the water hole at night and then having to go to another site. You just had to be really flexible in terms of your field plans in that area. And I didn't say this, but for any mist netting efforts, and a lot of times that was paired with acoustic surveys or just done as acoustic surveys, we would do like a site a night, and then at a couple of the tourism lodges, we had long-term like acoustic sampling done. But even those bat detectors were oftentimes impacted by baboons or lions. So it was a lot of repairing cables and microphones. But yeah, it was really cool. I always wish that I had another team on the ground with me, another truck where we could have done radio telemetry. But it's expensive to do that as a grad student on like your own salary. So yeah, that was, I guess I was kind of limited by my funding resources, only being from the funding that I brought in as a grad student. And yeah, if I could do anything differently, it would just basically be to try to get more people on the ground out there with me, try to attract, we had a couple of folks who came out, but they were like Rick and Gary, I think it was, were there right as I was leaving. It would have been great to have multiple groups of bat researchers in the area. And I would have loved if more locals had rabies pre-exposure vaccinations and would have been able to help more with the capture and handling as well. Folks were really, really interested and loved kind of seeing bats up close and personal. But of course, without rabies pre-exposure vaccinations, I don't want to be handing off any bats or responsibility of helping with captures that way. So I think that answers all of that.
Excellent, thank you very much. I mean, that's really great, and actually so helpful as well, because I know Cecilia and actually Quincy on this call are looking hopefully to go to do PhDs in the future. So that's wonderful, wonderful experience. And I think also for those of you who haven't had the privilege of going to Namibia, this is actually a really huge area. So when Theresa's saying, "Oh, I just had to kind of find another site," you know, it's a long way.
It would take like another 4 hours to drive to the next site. So yeah.
Yeah, and I do remember one point I was clambering around caves, and Theresa was trying to find me, bless, but we didn't have a signal, so she was visiting schools that I'd just been to, and you know, we just kind of, you kept missing me, didn't we? And when we were in Windhoek, we didn't manage to meet up, which was a real shame. Yeah. But yeah, and I think yeah, so we also have from Mari a comment saying, "Wonderful talk," and she is very glad that you have survived.
I am too. I don't want to scare anyone off. It's just you have to take a lot of precautions, and being kind of like the team leader on those projects, I was always worried, will my truck start? My battery died for like a month consistently, my primary battery, and I had a secondary in the back I'd have to jump it from, and would like, there was a night where I had to do that with a rhino coming towards the spring, and it's a little nerve-wracking, but a lot of fun. You just have to be really aware of your surroundings, and I don't think I'll ever sleep very solid again after a year plus of living there and being like, what was that? So yeah.
Oh, that's absolutely excellent, and a really nice comment from Bruce to say that your work might have been limited by funds, but not by your energy or your insights. A fantastic account. Thank you very much. So there's some nice comments coming in, and I'll make sure that you get those. So I just wanted to take the opportunity, if you could all just very quickly unmute yourself, and we're going to give you a round of applause.
All right. Yay.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining, especially if you're here in the US and the hour change threw everyone off. So
thanks very much, Theresa. Really appreciate it. And it's lovely to hear all about your great work.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel.